In the back-to-school edition of the What's New Author series, Sam Baltrusi chats with Christopher Rondina, author of Legends of Sleepy Hollow. The Newport, Rhode Island-based writer discusses the legends associated with vampires of New England, as well as the lingering legacy of Washington Irving's classic spooky story. Rondina will be featured at the upcoming Mass Paracon at the Seven Hills Inn on September 27th through 29th in Lenox, Massachusetts. Now, here's your host, Sam Baltrusi.
And welcome to the What's New Author series. My name is Sam Baltrusi. I'm an author and journalist. Joining me is Christopher Rondina. Hi, Christopher. How are you?
Doing great.
So we're going to talk about your new book, Legends of Sleepy Hollow. Before we get started, we're going to talk about what you started out as an author. You basically started writing about vampires.
I did back when I was a young whippersnapper. I loved collecting ghost stories and legends of the supernatural. And living in Rhode Island, I'd grown up hearing stories of local vampire folklore, and no one had ever really published on the subject, but I would see snippets in newspapers. Sometimes, the Halloween edition of a local newspaper would run a little story about it, but no one had ever really given any kind of in-depth examination of it. So I came up with what I thought was sensible idea of gathering together all those news clippings that I collected over the years and sort of publishing them in a pamphlet form. And I thought that would be something I could sell for a couple of bucks a pop. I mean, it was very unambitious. And a local bookstore owner, used bookstore owner, said to me, you can't really do that because of copyright restrictions, but you can do excerpts from the newspapers if you wrote a little intro to them. And he kind of guided me and stewarded me into this thing where I started actually writing without even realizing that I was writing it. And all of a sudden he would tell me that this one's okay, but it needs a little more fleshing out, etc. And before I knew it, I had 80 pages of book written.
Wow.
And that got outside of the publish as a pamphlet and into the actually publish a book. And when I really pulled it all together, an unfortunately no longer existing publisher out of Cape Cod decided to publish it for me, and it was called Vampire Legends of Rhode Island. And that's kind of how I got my feet wet in the publishing industry and in the legend hunting industry as well.
Well, when I first noticed you as an author, it was Vampires of New England. So tell me about that book specifically and sort of like the stories that kind of stand out to you from that book.
So Vampires of New England is my evolved version of Vampire Legends of Rhode Island. After a while, I realized that I was limiting my scope and that there were vampire cases or vampire folklore all over New England. So I started collecting more of that and expanded it into Vampires of New England several years after I published the original book. And it largely connects to the late 1700s into the late 1800s, when families all over New England believed that vampires or some kind of a hungry spirit were responsible for deaths in the family. These families, especially rural farm families, had strings of deaths where one by one different members of the family would die off, and they came to believe that it was being caused by some kind of, oh my goodness, some angry dogs out there, the children of the night, came to believe that it was caused by some sort of supernatural agency. And even at the time, I would say certainly in the late 1700s, the word vampire would never have occurred to them. It really wasn't even a common word in the English language yet, but clearly they believed that that people were rising from the grave and actually drawing out the life of their children, of their siblings, and it was widespread for about 100 years. And what ended up happening is that people across New England came up with different sort of folksy ways to dispatch these undead creatures, and they would go out to the graveyards. They would exhume families of the recently, or members of the recently dead families, and look for bodies that were uncorrupted. And if the body looked too fresh for the length of time that it was in the grave, they would presume that it was feeding off of people, and they would either burn the body or cut out its heart or other grisly methods, decapitation, in order to kill the corpse again.
So we were talking earlier about the ties to tuberculosis. Was that possible link to people being labeled as a vampire?
Very likely. It's sort of, that comes in a couple of stages. Tuberculosis, before we knew what it was, before we even identified the tuberculosis bacillus was often referred to as consumption. And of course, consumption means to eat, to consume. And the belief originally was that that condition was caused not by a germ, but by a supernatural being that was consuming your life force. And the irony of it, and one of the things that's really interesting whenever you explore folklore, is that when we discovered the nature of the germs that were causing tuberculosis, it didn't make a lot of difference to the people in these rural families, because what we were saying to them is, no, an invisible ghost isn't eating your family. Tiny invisible creatures flying through the air are killing your family instead. And they were like, so they're big ghosts or their little ghost, does it matter? And really, it didn't make a difference to them. So it's a pretty common belief that tuberculosis was probably the agent that was killing off these families. It was often referred to then as the White Death.
Wow.
But there are other fascinating wrinkles to it that make it at least a little more intriguing from sort of a supernatural or a paranormal perspective, which is that, number one, tuberculosis was certainly not just limited to farm families. It was fairly widespread, but tuberculosis didn't always explain away the symptoms that these families were experiencing, such as visitations. People that believed that vampires were responsible for killing them came to that conclusion because the sick members of the family would report visitations from deceased loved ones. They would say that their beloved sister or their mother who had passed away was coming into the room and visiting them at night. So there's certainly no reason that tuberculosis automatically explains that. Now, superstition might, but it's interesting that it was so common. And then the second is that when the suspect corpse, when the vampire corpse was exhumed and destroyed, in quite a few of the cases, it appears that the infection, the haunting, whatever it was, stopped. So again, it lends at least some question to the nature of it. And was it always tuberculosis? Is there a paranormal element to it? At least I like to say that I keep an open mind.
It sounds really similar to the Salem witch trials and Spectral Evidence as well.
It was very similar to that. I actually have a kind of a thing that I say, because the vampire folklore was very common in Rhode Island. It was incredibly common in Rhode Island. It might have been the state with the most cases, at least once upon a time we felt that it was. And Rhode Island was a state that was founded, or a colony that was founded on a level of religious freedom that was not common anywhere else in the American colonies at that time. And we're the only state in all of New England that never executed a witch. And what I like to say, because people sometimes drew on the fact that so many of these vampires were actually women, people said, well, is it a kind of an analog to that? Is it the same way we were persecuting women in places like Salem? Were they persecuting women in Rhode Island and just calling them vampires? And I said, well, it's certainly possible, but at least we had the decency to wait till they were dead.
But speaking of spectral evidence, like, what is your take on spectral evidence, and like, do you talk about it at all when you give tours?
Spectral evidence is something that doesn't come up a lot in the vampire stories, because there were very few incidences where any kind of legality was involved, unless it was the legality of exhuming the corpse. So spectral evidence wasn't really needed in any legal sense, but it does come up in other stories that are part of what I do. I wrote a book a few years ago called Ghosts of New England, and one of my favorite stories in it is a story from Portsmouth, Rhode Island, which might actually be the genesis of the bloodline of Lizzie Borden, of all strange things.
Really?
This is a kind of a complicated segue, but a woman in 1673, an elderly widow named Rebecca Cornell in 1673, was found burned to death in her home by her family, and it was ruled to be an accident initially, but after her death, her spirit started to visit her brother, who lived in a different town, and basically said that she'd been murdered and wanted him to investigate the crime. So he went and he told the local constables. The constables had old Mrs. Cornell's body exhumed, and they found that with a closer examination that there was a wound in her chest that was not consistent with death by fire, but that might prove that she'd actually been murdered, and that this visitation might actually be true. So the testimony of the ghost via her brother John Briggs is actually in the court records of the state of Rhode Island, and a man was hung for the crime based effectively on the testimony of a ghost. So spectral evidence certainly was it was widely it was widely accepted, at least in the late 1600s. I mean, that was before even the Salem witch trials. Started to peter out in the mid 1700s, when I think the age of reason started to dawn, and we didn't see ghosts around quite every corner at that point.
Well, to give you some backstory, so 1692, 19 innocent men and women were hanged for witchcraft. There's one gentleman, Giles Corey, who was pressed to death over a 2, maybe 3 day period. So they actually used spectral evidence, which is made up stuff. I saw the ghost of Goody Martin or Goody Rebecca Nurse sitting on the corner of my bed, and that was actually used to accuse and execute innocent people of witchcraft in 1692. So it kind of turned bad. And in the situation with Cornell, it actually was a good thing, because it...
Well, it may be, because of course we assume that the person executed for her crime was guilty, but it was all circumstantial evidence. And the circumstantial evidence, even if you review it today, is fairly compelling, and there aren't many other motives for the crime, but it was still purely circumstantial. So spectral evidence, certainly, I would say that there are other kinds of evidence that I feel a little more comfortable with at this point. No, the Giles Corey case is fascinating, because, of course, there's still the curse connected to that, which allegedly has followed just about every sheriff of Salem since then has died from either a heart condition or a blood disease of some sort, and they say that the Corey curse carries on since that time.
And also the curse with Giles Corey, he supposedly cursed the sheriff, which was Sheriff George Corwin, but he also cursed Salem. So if you see his specter, which I have no idea what he looks like, but if you see his specter, something bad will happen to Salem. And the last time he was spotted, it was right before the Great Fire of Salem that basically destroyed Salem in the 1900s. So if you see Giles Corey, run. It's not good. So you're going to be in my book, Ghost Writers, which is coming out in October, and we talk about your experience with actual ghosts. So kind of limited, but you have written about ghosts in the past.
I have, yes.
So tell me about that one experience that kind of changed your life.
Well, I mean, and I do believe in ghosts. I believe in ghosts. I also believe that an awful lot of accounts of ghosts are probably either misunderstandings, or just people, hallucinating, seeing things, or what have you. But I think that if 99.9% of all ghost sightings are fake, that 0.1% still proves that ghosts exist. And so I'm sort of what I would say is an open-minded skeptic, or at the very least a cautious believer. But when I was 15, between 15 and 16, to be honest, the actual placement of it, according to my birthday, I can't promise. But when I was a very young fellow, my newly remarried family moved into a beautiful Victorian home in my hometown of Newport. And it was a wonderful old house that I fell in love with immediately, because I already did like spooky things, and maybe that set me up a little bit. But this had like dark wood banisters and dark sort of red carpeting one through the hallways and everything. And it was a 3-story building, and we had the entire 2nd floor of it. And one of the things I fell in love with almost immediately, this house was clearly from the late 1800s, is all the old keyholes which still had their little iron keys stuck in them. So I was in love with this place, absolutely in love with it. And we had lived there for probably about a year when one of my best friends from school was staying the night, and we were both sitting up in bed. And I got very lucky, because the room that I got, it was a furnished house. We didn't have much money, and so we sort of were making do with what we had. And so I got the room that had the 2 twin beds, because my parents took the room with the big queen-size bed. So I ended up with the biggest bedroom in the house and all this great old Victorian furniture. So my best friend is over, and I'm sitting in one bed, and he's sitting in the other, and we're sitting up at night. It's probably 10 o'clock at night, talking about whatever kids talk about at that age. I don't know. It's certainly, pre-Pokemon, so it wasn't that. But we were talking about it, and the lights are off, but I could see a window that's directly ahead of me, and I kind of have to set up the positioning of the room, because it does play into the story. So 2 beds here, 2 twin beds. The door of the room is that way. I wasn't lucky, apparently, because the door of the room was in this direction. So 2 beds, window facing the street this way, window facing the street this way. So I was as far from the door of the room as I could be, and my friend Russ was in the other bed. And we both noticed that in the window across from us, you could see a kind of a mistiness, almost like somebody had shaken a blanket and the dust was there, and you could see it kind of sparkling there in the window. But the mistiness wasn't moving, like it was a column of mist, and it just sort of sat there in a way that didn't seem completely natural. And so after a few minutes of looking at it, and we both started talking about the fact that we were seeing this, we both jokingly said, ooh, maybe it's a ghost. But of course, we didn't believe in anything like that, and so we just kept watching it. And it did sort of move, but it was moving so slowly you could barely tell, and it was kind of moving gently and gently and gently towards the center of the room. And eventually I was beyond curious about whatever this thing was. It didn't have a face or arms or anything. It was just a column of mist. So I got up and I walked towards it. And as I walked towards it, it's like fog, the closer you get, the less you can see it. And I sort of put my hand out and started to sort of reach into the space where it was, and it didn't feel like anything. So eventually my body passed into the space where this mistiness was, and immediately I collapsed to the floor sobbing like a baby.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely racked with sobs. I mean, like such intense that I was clamped down like, as if I was in sorrow. And I was terrified because I didn't know what was happening. But the one thing I did know is that sorrow wasn't mine. I was like an observer. I was trapped in myself, and I could feel this happening to my body, but it wasn't me. So I was terrified. And while I'm laying there on the floor, it sort of lifted and it was gone. And I started to uncurl, but as soon as I unclenched, it snapped back down on me and held me again. And now I was horrified because I was afraid to even get up. And this happened a couple of times. Every time it would sort of start to dissipate and I'd relax even a little bit, it would clamp back down on me. And the third time, I'm waiting for it. I'm there waiting for it to start again when I feel it dissipate, and it doesn't. And I can hear someone saying, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't want to hurt you or anybody. You would never let me grow up. You wouldn't let me go. And I thought, what the heck is happening? And I finally have the guts to turn around, and my friend Russell, who was like in bed with the covers over his feet before, is now sitting on the edge of the bed, but he's not facing me. He's facing the other bed, and he's just talking just to nothing. And I thought, how could Russell do this to me? I mean, he's basically saying that he's done this to me. And then I realized, wait a minute, he's not talking to me. And it dawned on me very quickly that it wasn't Russell saying that he'd done this to me. It was whatever it was speaking through Russell. And that's when I guess maybe I was meant to be an investigator, because I leaped over my bed, belly first, grabbed the first pencil I could find, and I started writing down what it was saying. I wasn't scared. Maybe I wasn't scared because I'd already encountered the thing, sort of sensed it, but I wrote down what it was saying, and it was really the same things over and over. It really never got anywhere outside of, you never let me go, you wouldn't let me grow up, I didn't mean to hurt you, I didn't mean to hurt anyone, and these kind of phrases over and over again, and then it just sort of ended. He just stopped talking, kind of started muttering, and it was done. And the funny thing about all of this is that in the aftermath of it, as we discussed what had happened, and yes, we were terrified, we were absolutely terrified, but in the aftermath of it all, discussing it, he remembered everything that happened to me. He saw me get up, he saw me move into the space, he saw me fall on the floor, heard me crying, didn't know what to do, but he didn't remember what had happened to him during any of that period. When he was speaking, he couldn't remember a thing of it. So he blanked out during that period, but I didn't. When it was within me, I didn't blank out, and so I assume if it couldn't speak through me, I've always felt I mustn't have been compatible with it. I mean, whatever it was, it's like, I always say it's like putting the wrong software in a computer. I mean, obviously I wasn't what it needed to express itself. It managed to express itself through him. And, but that changed my life. That changed my life.
So I was asked earlier, what is a clairvoyant? That basically he was channeling. He was channeling the spirit, and sometimes it's called trance channeling, where he doesn't remember what was going on. So he probably did it without even knowing he was able to do it. Have you talked to him since then?
I have, and he has vague memories of the evening and basically still remembers it as he did then. I think he doesn't believe it was supernatural. He thinks maybe that we'd psyched ourselves up into being scared or something like that. But he's also in no way, no part of this life is part of his life. I mean, he doesn't, he's not a clairvoyant, he's not a psychic, he doesn't do anything like that. That was a one-time event for him, and I think he'd rather put it behind him.
It's one of those things that it's very scary to be able to go there, and it's a muscle that you work, and he hasn't obviously worked his muscle because he's terrified, and he was like, but he had that ability to do that, so that's kind of interesting. So let's start talking about your new book, Legends of Sleepy Hollow. Having read the book, so I was of course looking for the ghosts, like who represented what. So tell me the whole backstory to that. And it's been kind of like a lifelong adventure writing this book.
It has. I mean, part of what I do is I'm not a ghost hunter, not at least in the sense that I think a lot of modern people who investigate paranormal activity. That's not really what I do so much as I'm a legend hunter. I've always been fascinated by old legends, whether it's witches or werewolves or ghosts or what have you. And I grew up being fascinated by these old stories, so often they are the heart of what I investigate. And one of my favorite Halloween memories was the first time I encountered the legend of Sleepy Hollow, which I think, as everybody knows, is the story of the Headless Horseman. And I was probably 9 years old, and it was on Halloween night after trick-or-treating when the Disney Halloween special came on. And as a little kid, you didn't watch scary movies, when you're that age. And certainly my mom, this was the 70s, dating myself, but, my mom wasn't going to let us watch anything really, scary. But the Disney Halloween special, it's all like, Donald Duck and Goofy and silly little cute cartoons until it got to its big final segment, which was The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And it just showed the final chase scene between Ichabod Crane being chased out of Sleepy Hollow by the Headless Horseman. And I fell in love with it. I thought it was the most amazing and scary and wonderful sequence I'd ever seen. And I became fascinated by that story. And years later, reading the original story, I fell in love with it all over again. And I'd always, over the years, especially after I became a writer, thought that it would be fun to write a sort of an annotated version of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow that reprinted Washington Irving's story, but that gave some of the history behind it. Because over the years, I learned that Washington Irving had based the location of Sleepy Hollow on a real town, and that the people that were in it were inspired by real characters. So last year, I realized that this would be the 200th anniversary of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It was written in 2019. It was first published in 2020. 1819 and first published in 1820. So it's the 200th anniversary. And I thought, this is the time to do it. This is definitely the time to do it. So I had actually written the bulk of the book, and talked about the fact that even the Headless Horseman himself was allegedly inspired by real folklore from, folklore that came from Germany, folklore that came from old Irish legend. There are all these wonderful headless ghost stories. But while doing the research, I found a reference to a journal from 1798, more than 20 years before The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was written, about a Hessian soldier. In The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Washington Irving describes the Headless Horseman as a Hessian soldier, a German soldier, whose head had been carried away by a cannonball during some nameless battle of the American Revolution. And people had always assumed that Irving had made the ghost up, that he'd taken old folklore and invented his own ghost for it. But this journal from 1798 was a general who served under George Washington, and describes just after the Battle of White Plains, a young Hessian soldier who has his head blown off by a cannonball one morning on the 1st of November, All Hallows Day, the morning after Halloween of all times, and who, alongside his horse, dies on the field. And I thought, that's fascinating. In fact, a lot of scholars had believed, and this was the first I was hearing of it, but it wasn't the first time it had been discovered, that this was the genesis of the legend of the Headless Horseman. And I thought, well, that's amazing. Now all I really need, the cherry on the top of my book, is going to be to get the name of this soldier for the book. And I thought, well, so one of these scholars out here has this information. So I contacted everybody I knew who'd ever researched the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and they all said, no, don't have any idea who the soldier was, but we know he was there. And I thought, this is crazy. This information has to exist. He's a soldier. He has a military record. So a good friend of mine who works with Rise Up Paranormal, Chris Blanchett, is an extraordinary researcher and historian, and he tracked down some archives or some records of Hessian soldiers that were in the U.S. during the American Revolution. And I thought, well, that's what I needed to find. And the record that was here in the U.S. was incomplete and didn't have the data for the regiments I needed. It didn't have the data for the times. So I eventually had to go to Germany to track him down. And so that's what I did last November. Just a few days after Halloween, I jumped on a plane and I went to a beautiful medieval city called Marburg in the heart of Germany, where the Hessian soldiers came from, and tracked down the identity of the original Headless Horseman.
And part of the fun of reading the book is actually going on that journey with you. So you kind of take us along, like this happened and this happened. Then I flew to Germany. So so it had been a lot of fun, right?
It was, and it was very unexpected. I mean, I certainly never, in any of this, I never expected to have to go farther than Sleepy Hollow, which is a few hours from my house. And I'd gone down there and taken some photos, but the idea of going to Germany, on a whim for just a few days, and then tracking down a piece of information that had been lost for 200 years, that wasn't part of the plan. And I even, in Germany, knew that there was a chance I wouldn't find it, and it was whether it was luck or serendipity or what, I don't know, but there I was with yellowed papers from the 1700s spread out in front of me on a table in this little German town, speaking barely a word of German, and I get there and I find these dense, tiny little script in old German all on these pages, and I was mortified. I was like, I can't read this. I can barely read the letters because it's so old and it's it's so faded and everything. And I actually got all the way there, and I knew what I was looking for, but when I had the paperwork in front of me, I didn't know how to interpret any of it and how to find it. So I thought, even with the papers in front of me, I thought I'd failed. I really thought I'd failed. And the people at the archive there in Marburg were very gracious and agreed to scan some of the documents for me if I could limit it to a few documents. So I limited it to a few documents that I thought, because of their dates, would be the correct ones. And they scanned them for me in high resolution, sent them to me, and the next night they arrived on my tablet. And I'm lying in this hostel in this little town in Germany, staring like an idiot at my tablet and trying to decode every letter on these pages. And all of a sudden, one magical word leapt out at me on a page, and it was a word that looked like it said "with plane," and I recognized that it was too close to White Plains, where this battle had happened, for it to be a mistake. And when I used that and started looking, it was like my Rosetta Stone. When I had that one key and I started to track it and place it into different locations on the page, I ended up finding the one soldier who I believed had died that day. But then sort of fate threw a sort of a twist in the path, and they gave me two soldiers who died that day. And that was almost worse. It was almost worse because when I first started out, I had about 90 soldiers to work with, and I had to whittle it down. And being able to only whittle it down to two would have probably killed me. So I had to that's where I had to get a little bit Sherlock, do some detective work, and realize that the journal by Major William Heath that had mentioned this soldier referenced that a German artilleryman, a Hessian artilleryman, had had his head blown off on this particular morning and died there on the field alongside his horse, which was in itself already a little bit, delicious because it was such a perfect replication of the story. But I thought about it, and I looked at the ranks of these soldiers, and one of them I knew was a grenadier, and a grenadier was basically a grenade-throwing soldier, and I thought he was a likely candidate, but the other soldier, I couldn't figure out what he was at first until I realized, with a little bit of my own background in linguistics, that the word describing him was tambour, T-A-M-B-O-U-R, and that he was a drummer. And drummers who helped marching battalions keep time. And I thought, there's no way that a seasoned general would mistake a drummer, who usually were their kids, they were usually like teenagers, wearing very distinctive livery with chevrons all up the sleeves. There's not a way in the world that any competent general could ever mistake a drummer for an artilleryman. And thank goodness I was able to weed him out that way and find that I had my grenadier, my grenade-throwing, big, bulky, heavy-duty soldier who ironically, since one of the climactic moments in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is when the Headless Horseman takes his pumpkin head and hurls it at Ichabod Crane, a grenadier's job is to take a big clay grenade, light the fuse, and hurl it into his enemies, taking out crowds of enemies. So irony or coincidence, even the identity, the soldier's job, matched him perfectly to the Headless Horseman.
So we're getting to the tail end of the show. Christopher, it's fantastic having you on. We have an event coming up in September 27th through September 29th, the Mass Paracon. And Christopher's going to be there. Hope you guys can maybe pick up your copy there of Legends of Sleepy Hollow. So how do people purchase the book?
They can go to my website, which is ghostboypress.com. Or track me down at any of the many events I'll be doing throughout the months of September, October, across New England and in Sleepy Hollow, New York. So you can either find me on Facebook, Christopher Rondina, and I'll list my different appearances, or go to ghostboypress.com and you can buy my books directly.
Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure talking to you. And
thank you.
This is the last in a 3-part series of What's New Author Series. It was fantastic. Have a great month, everybody. See you for Halloween.